When my future mother-in-law invited me to see the condo she had just bought for our marital home, I was stunned upon arrival. Was this not the exact condo I was currently renting out? I turned and asked my future mother-in-law, Mrs. Reynolds, "Is this really the place you prepared for us?" I had always imagined my engagement would be a beautiful, joyful milestone. There would be our families coming together to celebrate, offering toasts to a solid foundation and a happy future. I never expected that one day I would stand in the middle of a theatrical play where I was both the victim and the one pulling the curtain. For almost 3 years, I had been constantly pressured to settle down. My mother told me directly that I was an adult and could not possibly want to be alone forever. She worried about my biological clock, fearing I would miss my chance to start a family and end up lonely. It was not that I did not want to get married. I just always felt something was missing until I met Brandon. Brandon appeared at the perfect time, like a neatly wrapped gift. He was attractive, soft-spoken, claimed to have studied abroad in Europe, and now worked in luxury architectural imports. He also mentioned he came from a wealthy family. He took great care of me. He remembered what I liked and what I feared. Even when the weather in Chicago was freezing, he would drape his coat over my shoulders. After almost 2 years of dating, my parents were thrilled. My mother said it was a relief someone could finally handle my standards. I even thought to myself that maybe this was the time to stop searching. That was until one afternoon. I was at the office when Brandon's mother, Mrs. Reynolds, called me. She sounded ecstatic. She asked if I had time that afternoon because she wanted to take me to look at a condo. I was surprised and asked what condo she meant. She chuckled and said it was the condo for our marriage. Since Brandon and I had been dating for a while, she told me she and Brandon's father had prepared a unit for us, and she wanted me to see it so we could renovate anything that was lacking. I was a bit hesitant because we were not even officially engaged yet. Why were we already looking at a marital home? But I figured her intentions were good, and it would be rude to decline. I drove my car, following the address she texted me. The closer I got, the faster my heart raced. The streets were very familiar. It was a luxury high-rise complex by Lake Michigan with strict security. When the GPS announced I had arrived at my destination, I saw the sign for Harborview Residences, Tower 9. My hands felt ice cold. That was the exact condo unit I had purchased when I was 24, using my first massive bonus from a major design project. I had personally picked out every tile and light fixture. Later, because I frequently traveled out of state for business, I handed over the property management to my best friend Danielle to rent it out. The rent of $3,000 a month went straight into my bank account. The lease was for 3 years. I had almost forgotten I owned a unit in this city. But today, that very condo was becoming the marital home prepared by Brandon's family for me. Mrs. Reynolds was already waiting in the lobby, wearing an elegant purple dress with her hair perfectly styled. Seeing me, she smiled widely. She greeted me warmly and urged me to come up, promising I would love it. I took a deep breath and followed her into the elevator. The doors opened on the 9th floor. I walked down the familiar hallway and headed straight toward Unit 901 out of pure reflex. Mrs. Reynolds took out a key, and as she opened the door, she boasted that she and her husband had bought the place in cash. She claimed the renovations alone cost over $100,000 and that everything was imported. The door opened. The smell of a cheap air freshener mixed with the familiar scent of the hardwood floors I had chosen myself. The living room was exactly the same. The cream sofa, the navy blue lounge chair by the window, and the molecular chandelier I had bought for almost $3,000. Every detail felt like a needle to my eyes. This was my house. I stood frozen. Mrs. Reynolds pulled me inside by my hand. She told me that once I became her daughter-in-law, this house would be mine. My voice was hoarse as I asked her if she truly bought this condo for Brandon and me. She laughed loudly and assured me she did, though she added that the deed was in her husband's name for now. I walked over to the TV stand and looked at a metal sculpture I had bought at an art exhibition for $1,000. The moment my hand touched it, Mrs. Reynolds quickly swatted my hand away. She warned me to be careful, saying it was extremely expensive and that I should not touch it lest I break it. I looked at her with a cynical smile. I told her that if it was my own property, I could just get it fixed if it broke. She looked awkward for a moment, then laughed nervously, saying she just meant valuable things should be protected. I did not comment further. After leaving the condo, I sat in my car for a long time before calling Danielle. I asked her who was currently renting Unit 901. Danielle immediately answered that it was Mrs. Reynolds. She said she had been renting it for 2 years, claiming it was for her son's upcoming wedding preparation. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. I asked if the lease was still active. Danielle confirmed it was, adding that the rent was $3,000 a month and she always paid exactly on time. She asked why I wanted to know, but I simply hung up the phone. $3,000 a month. This supposedly million-dollar marital home was actually my own rental property. That night, Brandon called me. His voice was full of hope. He asked how I liked the condo, emphasizing that his parents had prepared it with such careful detail. I answered calmly that it was beautiful. He expressed his relief and suggested our families meet the following week to discuss the engagement. I looked out the window at the pale yellow streetlights. A plan began to form in my head. If they had built such a complicated, elaborate play, I was not going to stop it in the middle of the act. I would wait until the audience was at its peak, and when the curtain opened, everyone would see everything clearly. I replied to him and said I would be looking forward to it. The following weekend, Brandon's family came over to discuss the engagement. My mother was so excited that she booked a private room at one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. I purposefully ordered the most expensive menu items and added several bottles of premium wine. I saw Brandon paying for it in installments through a digital high-interest credit app. I saw it clearly. After the meal, my mother calmly brought up the topic of asset protection. She stated that before any wedding planning continued, our family's lawyers would be drafting an ironclad prenuptial agreement, prenup. Brandon would leave with absolutely nothing if there was infidelity, fraud. Reynolds' face instantly turned pale. An ironclad prenup might not be a big deal for people who truly loved each other, but for people who had to rent my condo for $3,000 a month, it was a legal wall that completely blocked their scam. I just kept smiling. The play was going exactly according to plan. The night before the engagement party, I received a phone call from a woman named Victoria. She told me she had been Brandon's girlfriend for 3 years. I was not surprised. I already had enough evidence in my hands, including photos of Brandon going in and out of nightclubs and hotels with many different women. Victoria said she was going to crash the engagement party. I simply told her to come. On the morning of the engagement party, Mrs. Reynolds insisted on hosting a pre-celebration brunch at Condo 901. She wanted to show off the million-dollar marital home to my relatives before the big event. My relatives gasped in awe, praising the spacious and beautiful apartment. In the midst of the laughter and chatting, Mrs. Reynolds' phone rang. She accidentally answered it on speakerphone. A man's voice echoed through the room, telling her that this month's rent had not been transferred and was 3 days late. The room froze. Mrs. Reynolds stammered, claiming it was a wrong number. I looked at my parents. Their expressions began to change, but I still did not say anything. It was not time yet. This was just the beginning. The living room of Unit 901 still smelled of fresh flowers and newly opened pastries, but the atmosphere felt as heavy as lead. After that phone call demanding rent, no one spoke openly. But everyone's eyes looked different. My mother set down her teacup. The sound of porcelain hitting the glass table was piercingly clear. She no longer looked at Mrs. Reynolds. Instead, she turned to me. She asked me to follow her to the balcony for a moment. I nodded. Brandon, who was standing next to me, lightly touched my elbow as if to hold me back, but I kept walking away. Out on the balcony, the chilly wind from Lake Michigan blew hard. My mother stared at me for a long time before asking softly what was actually going on. I looked down at the traffic below and asked her what she thought was going on. She fell silent. I knew my mother was not foolish. She was just fighting a battle between maintaining family pride and trusting a mother's intuition. She noted slowly that the phone call did not sound like a wrong number at all, and questioned how a family as rich as theirs could be chased for rent. I turned to face her and asked if she would believe me if I told her this condo was mine. She was stunned and asked what I meant. I explained that I bought it 3 years ago and had my friend rent it out for me, and that the tenant was Mrs. Reynolds. My mother's face went pale. She told me not to speak nonsense on a day like this. I told her I was not speaking nonsense. I unlocked my phone and showed her the digital lease agreement, complete with the tenant's name and social security number. I told her to look at it herself. Her hands were shaking as she held my phone. Her lips were pressed tightly together. A moment later, she handed the phone back to me. Her voice grew heavy as she asked how long I had known. I told her I knew since the day Mrs. Reynolds brought me here to see our wedding home. My mother closed her eyes and took a deep breath. I saw in her eyes not only anger but also regret. She was the one who had pushed me the hardest to get married. She was the one who firmly believed Brandon's family was the perfect match. She quietly apologized to me. I shook my head and told her it was not too late. We returned to the living room. The atmosphere was still incredibly awkward. My father sat with his back completely straight, staring at Brandon without blinking. Brandon tried to keep his composure, laughing and chatting with my relatives, but his smile was no longer natural. The house viewing ended in severe discomfort. Both families then moved to the country club for the official engagement ceremony. I sat in the car with my mom and dad. No one spoke during the entire ride. When the car stopped at the club's lobby, my dad finally spoke. His voice was raspy. He asked me what my plan was. I stared straight ahead and said I wanted them to admit it themselves. My dad looked at me for a long time, then nodded and said he trusted me. Those 3 words were enough to melt my heart. The reception hall was decorated luxuriously. Relatives from both sides had gathered in large numbers. Brandon wore a sharp black suit, his hair perfectly styled. From the outside, he still looked like the perfect future son-in-law. The event began. Representatives from both families gave speeches. Mrs. Reynolds smiled and spoke enthusiastically, mentioning the new house, a stable life, and getting a wonderful daughter-in-law. I listened to it all with a cold heart. When it was time to exchange rings, Brandon held my hand and whispered that, after today, I would officially be his future wife. I looked at him and asked if he was sure. He paused for a moment and asked what was wrong. I did not answer. After exchanging rings, the host announced the screening of our love story montage. The giant screen lit up. The first few photos appeared exactly as planned, showing Brandon and me at cafes and on vacations, capturing moments that looked incredibly happy. Everyone smiled. But when the 5th photo appeared, the image suddenly changed. On the screen, Brandon was hugging another woman at a nightclub. The purplish-red neon lights highlighted his face. Whispers immediately broke out. "Mrs." Reynolds jumped to her feet, screaming to turn it off right now. But the next picture was already up. Brandon was walking into a hotel with a different woman. Then, a photo of him kissing Victoria inside a car. The entire hall erupted in chaos. Brandon's face was dead pale. He turned to me and asked what I was doing. I looked at him calmly and told him to just say it was a trap and that someone was trying to frame him. Victoria stepped forward from the guest seating area. She was wearing a red dress. Her face was pale, but her eyes were full of rage. She yelled at Brandon, asking how much longer he was going to lie. "Mrs." Reynolds ran over and grabbed Victoria, demanding to know who she was and telling her not to ruin her son's event. Victoria laughed bitterly. She announced that she and Brandon had been dating for 3 years and that Chloe was nothing but his wallet. The commotion escalated. My father stood up and firmly asked Brandon to explain. Brandon looked around, panic in his eyes. He dropped to his knees in front of me, his voice choking. He told me he was wrong, that he made a mistake, but that he truly loved me. I looked down at him and asked if he loved me or if he loved my family's wealth. He was taken aback and asked what I meant. I pronounced every word clearly for everyone to hear. I told him that Unit 901 belonged to me. I stated that I bought it 3 years ago, and for the past 2 years, his mother had been renting it. I noted the lease was still active. The entire room went dead silent. Mrs. Reynolds stammered, accusing me of talking nonsense. I handed my phone to my father. He glanced at it, then turned to Brandon's family, asking Mrs. Reynolds how she could explain this. "Mrs." Reynolds' face was stark white. She could not say a single word. Brandon looked at me in disbelief. He accused me of investigating him and building an elaborate play just to trick him. I asked him if I did not have the right to find out the truth. Brandon clenched his fists, his voice shifting from pleading to furious. He accused me of humiliating him on purpose. I laughed cynically and told him he humiliated himself. Victoria stood to the side, tears streaming down her face, realizing he had been lying to her too. Brandon turned to her and snapped at her to shut up. That single shout was enough to reveal his true colors to everyone in the room. My father stepped forward, his voice absolute, standing right beside me for support. I didn't need to be told what to do. I looked at the diamond on my finger, slowly slid it off, and placed it in the palm of Brandon's hand. I told him to keep it, and that he could use the $2 million trust fund to pay his rent. Brandon stood frozen. My mother grabbed my hand and told me it was time to go home. We left the hall amidst the stares of 100 guests. Behind me, the sound of arguing was still loud, but I never looked back. Once outside, the wind blew fiercely. I took a deep breath. My mother held my hand tightly and asked if I was okay. I nodded and assured her I was fine. My dad looked at me, his eyes filled with pride, stating that his daughter could not be easily fooled. I glanced back, looking at the hotel building one last time. A chapter had ended, but the fallout was definitely not over. I knew Brandon would not just give up. People like him, when backed into a corner, would do anything. My phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "You think this is over?" I smiled slightly to myself. Not yet. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before locking the phone without replying. People who are truly afraid look for ways to explain. People who are cornered look for ways to strike back. I knew Brandon was the latter. The car began to move. My mom sat next to me, her hand still refusing to let go of mine. My dad drove in the front. His posture was rigid, and no one spoke, but the atmosphere was no longer as heavy as it was that morning. It felt like we had just survived a massive hurricane. The furniture might still be a mess, but the sky was beginning to clear. When we got home, my mother locked the door and turned to me, asking me to tell them everything. I sat down and recounted the entire story from the beginning. From the day Mrs. Reynolds took me to see Unit 901 to the moment I called Danielle to confirm, all the way to hiring a private investigator to look into Brandon. I did not hide a single detail. My dad listened intently, his hands clasped together. He asked if I had planned to expose them at the engagement party right from the start. I looked at him and said yes. I explained that I wanted them to unmask themselves in front of a crowd, because if I confronted them in private, they would have just denied it. My mom sighed. She admitted she had been angry with me earlier, even threatening to disown me if I ruined the day. She expressed her relief that I did not listen to her. I smiled faintly and told her I knew she just wanted the best for me. She shook her head, stating that good intentions without vigilance are basically a recipe for disaster. I could not sleep that night. It was not because of a broken heart, but because I knew this was not the end. Brandon and his family's pride had been trampled in public. A man like him would not just accept that humiliation. The next morning, gossip spread like wildfire among our relatives. My phone rang nonstop. Some asked questions, some were curious, others felt pity. I gave them all short answers, saying everything was already clear. By noon, Danielle called me. She sounded frantic. She told me there was a problem. When I asked what it was, she said Mrs. Reynolds came to apartment 901 that morning saying she wanted to vacate the unit immediately. But that was not all. She was demanding a $50,000 reimbursement for renovation costs, claiming she had spent that much on upgrades. I let out a small laugh and asked what renovations she meant. Danielle said she claimed to have replaced the kitchen cabinets, installed built-in wardrobes, and repainted the walls. I remembered perfectly well that before I rented it out, I had completely remodeled the condo. Even if they did change something, it was on their own initiative. I reminded Danielle that the lease clearly stated the tenant could not alter the structural integrity and that any renovations required written consent from the owner. I told her we would just follow the contract. Danielle paused for a moment, then asked if they were going to cause trouble. I told her maybe not yet, but trouble was definitely coming. That afternoon, Brandon showed up at the gate of my office building. I had just finished work and saw him standing there. His suit was still relatively neat, but his face was haggard with dark circles under his eyes. I stopped a few steps away from him and asked what he wanted. He looked at me. His gaze was no longer as gentle as it used to be, but rather a mix of resentment and desperation. He said we needed to talk. I told him I thought we were done talking. He stepped closer, his voice dropping, saying I had pushed him into a dead end. I looked him dead in the eye and said he chose that path himself. He asked if I knew he got fired after the incident, claiming the company heard the gossip and let him go immediately, and that clients were pulling their contracts. He asked if I was satisfied now. I did not answer right away. A fleeting sense of pity crossed my mind. But then I remembered the look on his face when he screamed at Victoria. I remembered his plan to use me. I told him he lost his job because he lived a lie, not because of me. Brandon ground his teeth. He asked if I thought I won, admitting I successfully humiliated him, but pointing out I got nothing out of it either. He tauntingly asked who else would want to marry me after this. I laughed and asked him if I really needed someone to want to marry me. He was stunned. I continued, reminding him that Condo 901 was mine, my design firm was thriving, and my parents were by my side. I asked him exactly what it was that I had lost. His face turned red. He called me cruel. I replied that refusing to let myself be scammed further was not cruel. He stayed silent for a few seconds before suddenly softening his voice. He begged me for one more chance, saying he was truly wrong and that we could start over from scratch. He promised to prove he could change. I stared at the man in front of me, suddenly feeling he was a complete and terrifying stranger. For 2 years, I believed he was a responsible man. It turned out he was only responsible for his own self-interest. I told him slowly that he did not love me, but rather he loved the prospects I could provide. Brandon laughed bitterly, arguing that everyone is realistic to some degree, and that I was too. I agreed I was realistic, which was exactly why I refused to marry someone who viewed marriage as an investment contract. He had no words left. His gaze slowly turned cold. He hissed that I would regret this. I answered calmly that I already regretted ever trusting him. I told him we were done. I walked past him and got into my car. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing frozen on the busy sidewalk, his shadow stretching long under the late afternoon sun. That night, my mother sat next to me in the living room. She asked if Brandon met with me. I said yes, and mentioned he had been fired. My mother sighed and asked if I felt guilty. I thought about it for a second, then shook my head, stating I had done nothing wrong. My mom looked at me for a long time before saying quietly that she was just afraid a desperate person would do something reckless. Her words put me on high alert. Right at that moment, my phone buzzed again. It was a message from an unknown number. "You think a lease agreement can save you? Be careful with apartment 901. My heart pounded. I immediately called Danielle. She did not pick up. I tried again. Still nothing. A terrible feeling washed over me. I turned to my parents and said I needed to go to 901. My dad immediately stood up and said he was coming with me. We drove fast through the night. As we approached, I could see the flashing blue and red lights from a distance. A crowd had gathered in front of the building. I got out of the car, my heart beating out of my chest. A security guard ran up to me, recognizing me as the owner of Unit 901. I nodded. He told me the unit just had a small fire in the kitchen, but thankfully they put it out quickly. I froze. A fire. Only one face flashed through my mind: Brandon. I stood at the base of Harborview Residences with ice-cold hands. The fire truck lights were being turned off. Only a few police officers, security guards, and curious neighbors remained, whispering among themselves. A faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. My dad stood next to me, his hand ready to support my back as if he was afraid I would collapse. He did not ask any questions, but I knew his mind was in the exact same place as mine. The security guard escorted us to the 9th floor. The hallway outside 901 smelled of ash. The door was wide open, and the lights inside were blazing. Danielle stood in the middle of the living room. Her hair was a mess and her eyes were red. Seeing me, she ran over and said she was so glad I came. I asked her how it caught fire, trying my best to keep my voice steady. Danielle swallowed hard. She explained there was a gas leak at the stove, and the flame caught the wooden cabinets above it. A neighbor saw the smoke and immediately alerted security, and they managed to extinguish it. I walked into the kitchen. Parts of the wall were blackened. The wooden cabinets were scorched, and the granite countertop had a hairline crack. It was not a massive fire, but it left a clear mark. I crouched down and saw that the gas regulator valve had been connected far too loosely. I asked Danielle if anyone had been inside the condo before the fire. Danielle shook her head, explaining that Mrs. Reynolds had come by that morning to grab some things, but Danielle kept the keys. Danielle unlocked the door for her, and after that, Mrs. Reynolds left. I asked what time she left. Danielle said around 3 in the afternoon. I checked my watch. It was almost 10 at night. That was a long window of time. My dad, standing beside me, narrowed his eyes. He asked me who I thought did this. I did not answer, but the text message I received earlier replayed clearly in my mind. Be careful with apartment 901. Right then, my phone rang. It was Brandon. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. I asked him if he had anything else he wanted to say. The voice on the other end was no longer as sharp as it was that afternoon. It sounded heavier, as if he was suppressing something. He asked if I was at 901. I gripped my phone tightly and asked him how he knew. He let out a dark little laugh, a laugh that sent shivers down my spine. He told me he just wanted to warn me that the condo was highly flammable, especially if the gas lines were old. I asked if he was threatening me. He feigned innocence, claiming he was just worried about me. His voice sounded entirely manufactured. He added that if I did not give him a way to survive, who knows what could happen. My father, hearing snippets of the call, signaled for me to put it on speaker. I complied. My dad spoke up, his voice calm but completely authoritative. He asked Brandon to repeat what he just said. There was a few seconds of dead silence on the line. Brandon finally responded, calling him sir, and claiming he did not say anything, but his voice had lost all its confidence. My father told him slowly that if anything else happened to his daughter's property, he would pursue maximum legal action. He asked Brandon if he made himself clear. The call immediately disconnected. I lowered the phone, my hands shaking slightly. Not out of fear, but from the realization that this issue had escalated far beyond a bad breakup. Danielle grabbed my arm and asked if that was Brandon. I did not confirm it. I just told Danielle to please change all the locks tomorrow and install security cameras inside and out. My dad nodded and told me to report it to the police. I hesitated for a moment. If I filed a report, the situation would escalate tremendously. But if I did not, Brandon would think I was scared. I firmly agreed to report it. We went downstairs to file an incident report with building security and the police. Fortunately, no one was hurt and the financial damage was relatively minor. But in my heart, the last remaining shred of trust I ever had for Brandon was officially incinerated. I got home very late that night. My mother was still waiting in the living room. Seeing me, she immediately asked how everything was and if the fire was out. I assured her it was out and no one was hurt. My mom sighed in relief, then looked at me with deep concern, asking if this was his doing. I sat next to her, resting my head on her shoulder like I did when I was a little girl. I told her I had no concrete proof, but I knew it was him. My mother was quiet for a moment, then whispered that while I was strong, she was still a mother, and she was terrified. I squeezed her hand and told her I was scared too, but I could not back down. The next morning, detectives from the Chicago Police Department came to Unit 901 to investigate. They noted the suspicious loosening of the gas regulator, but there was not enough forensic evidence to definitively rule it as arson. I did not explicitly name Brandon as a suspect, but I provided them with the threatening text messages. That afternoon, Mrs. Reynolds showed up at the edge of our property. She was wearing simple clothes, completely stripped of the luxurious aura she flaunted at the engagement party. Seeing me, she rushed forward and blocked my driveway. She looked completely broken, burying her face in her hands as she sat heavily on the steps of my porch. She cried, begging me to drop the police report. I was stunned. I told her I had not accused anyone, but the police had gone to her house asking questions. She cried that the neighbors were whispering and she had no dignity left. My mother walked out of the house, watching the scene without saying a word. Mrs. Reynolds looked up at me with bloodshot eyes, insisting Brandon made a mistake but was not evil enough to kill anyone. She begged me to forgive him this one time, promising to take him far away. I stared at the woman who had once proudly paraded my own condo around as my wedding gift. Now, she was kneeling at my feet. All the arrogance was gone. I spoke to her slowly. I told her that if the fire last night had been just a little bit bigger, the entire building could have been in danger. I asked her if she ever thought about that. She looked down, saying she knew she was wrong from the very beginning. I asked her if she actually knew where her mistake lay. She stayed silent. I told her it was not when they rented the condo. It was when she and Brandon looked at me as an investment asset. They thought they could use marriage to turn a profit. Mrs. Reynolds trembled, claiming she just wanted her son to have a good future. I replied that a future built on lies would never last. A long silence followed. My mother approached gently and helped Mrs. Reynolds to her feet. She told her to go home and let the process run its course. Mrs. Reynolds looked at me one last time, her eyes a mix of resentment and pleading, before leaving in silence. Brandon did not call or text that night, but I knew he had not given up. A guy like Brandon, when he feels defeated, looks for a way to flip the board. I stood by the window, looking out at the familiar suburban street. In my heart, there was no more anger, only cold vigilance. If he wanted to keep playing this game, I would not hide. But this time, I was not just protecting myself, I was protecting my family. After the incident with Mrs. Reynolds kneeling at our gate, things seemed calmer on the surface. Brandon stopped calling and texting. The locks at apartment 901 were replaced, and cameras were installed inside and out. The police occasionally followed up, but because the damages were minor, the case remained an open investigation without immediate arrests. However, I knew a calm surface did not mean the storm was over. 3 days later, my design firm received an anonymous letter addressed to the board of directors. It accused me of using personal relationships to manipulate contracts and embezzling company funds. I did not have to guess who sent it. My boss called me into his office. He was a man in his 50s, calm, with more business experience than I could fathom. He looked at me directly and asked if I had personal issues with someone recently. I met his gaze and admitted I did, and that the person was trying to pressure me. He nodded, stating he had reviewed my track record since my first day. My performance was clear, and the anonymous letter provided zero concrete proof, but he advised me to be incredibly careful. I thanked him and left his office, realizing Brandon was shifting his strategy. He was no longer attacking me physically. He was attacking my reputation and my career. I told my parents about it that night. My mother sighed, noting he was truly desperate. My dad thought for a moment and asked if I planned to press civil charges. I shook my head, explaining I did not have enough proof for the fire, and I could handle the corporate slander internally. My dad looked at me intensely and said he did not want me wrestling in the mud, but if necessary, he would step in. I knew he was serious. My dad was a retired teacher who spent his whole life preaching honesty. He despised underhanded tactics like Brandon's. I smiled and assured him I was not fighting this alone. The next day, Victoria unexpectedly contacted me. She asked to meet at a small, quiet coffee shop. Victoria arrived first. She was not wearing the heavy makeup she had on at the engagement party. She looked at me with exhausted eyes, devoid of any past malice. As soon as I sat down, she apologized to me. I asked her why she was apologizing. She looked down and said it was because she had called me just his wallet. She admitted she was just another pawn in his game, too. I looked at the girl across from me. She had once appeared as a homewrecker, but now she was just another victim of his betrayal. I asked her why she wanted to meet. Victoria took a deep breath and revealed that Brandon was in deep debt with loan sharks. I froze. She explained that after losing his job, his debts piled up the engagement party expenses, the failed financial guarantee, the condo rent, and his previous bad investments. She heard he needed fast cash, or he was going to lose everything. I frowned and asked if she knew what his plan was. She shook her head, saying she only knew that a few days ago, people showed up at his house demanding money and they had a massive fight. She just wanted to warn me to be careful. I thanked Victoria and went home. On the drive back, my mind was racing. If Brandon was truly cornered by debt, the chances of him coming after me again were incredibly high. That night, just as I arrived home, a strange SUV was parked in front of our gate. 3 men were sitting inside, watching me closely. My father stepped outside first, blocking my path. He demanded to know who they were looking for. One of the men opened the door and stepped out, saying they were looking for Chloe. I stepped forward and said, "That was me." The man looked me up and down and asked what my relationship was with Brandon. I immediately understood. I told him we had no relationship. He smirked and noted that he heard we were getting married and that Brandon borrowed money specifically to prepare to marry his rich wife. The man smirked. "We heard he's marrying a rich architect. He owes our boss a lot of money from underground sports betting, and he promised his wealthy fiancée would cover it." My heart pounded. "His debts have nothing to do with me," I stated firmly. The man stepped closer. "Maybe. But you better tell him to pay up, or we'll keep visiting your properties." My father stepped up, demanding they get off our property immediately before he called the cops. The man glared at my dad, then at me with a calculating look. Finally, he waved at his guys to get back in the SUV. The car drove off, but it left behind a level of anxiety I had never felt before. I walked into the house, my hands trembling slightly. My mom grabbed my shoulders, saying this had gotten way too dangerous. I sat on the couch and took a deep breath. I told them he put my name on his debt, which meant he committed fraud. My dad immediately said we were going to the police precinct first thing in the morning and that we could not let this drag on. I nodded. This was no longer about feelings or pride. This was a major legal issue. That night, I sat alone in my room, reviewing the entire chain of events. From apartment 901, the engagement party, the fire, the anonymous corporate letter, to this debt crisis. Brandon was not just a romantic con artist. He was the kind of person who would drag everyone else into the abyss as he fell. I opened my phone and sent one short text to Brandon. "You put my name on a loan." It took him 10 minutes to reply. I didn't have a choice. I read that sentence over and over. I typed back, "You are destroying yourself." Delivered. No reply. I put my phone down and walked out to the balcony. The night air was cool. Inside my heart, there was no more rage. There was only absolute resolve. I had given him the chance to walk away quietly, but he chose to drag me into his hurricane. This time, I would not just play defense. I was going to end this through the justice system. The next morning, my dad and I went to the CPD precinct. The sky was clear, but my heart felt as cold as if I had just walked through a blizzard. I brought all the evidence: Brandon's text messages, a copy of the Unit 901 lease, and the recorded phone call from the night of the fire. The detective taking our report was a man in his 40s who spoke calmly. He listened to my entire explanation without interrupting. He clarified, asking if I was stating this man forged my name on a loan. I confirmed it, explaining that 3 men showed up at my house saying Brandon used my name for wedding preparation loans. The detective nodded. He explained that if there were indications of forged signatures or identity theft, it was a felony. He instructed me to file the official report so they could open an investigation. I looked at my dad and he gave a slow nod. I signed the police report without my hand shaking once. This feeling was different from when I took off my engagement ring. That was a matter of the heart. Today was drawing a hard line between right and wrong. Walking out of the precinct, my dad softly told me I did the right thing. I looked at him and asked if he was disappointed in me for choosing the wrong person. He smiled faintly and said everyone makes bad choices, but what matters is knowing when to walk away. That night, I checked my credit report online and my blood ran cold. Brandon had used my social security number, which he accessed when booking our wedding venue, to open multiple high-yield credit cards and personal online loans. It was textbook identity theft. The next morning, my dad and I went back to the CPD precinct with my credit reports. The detective confirmed that the unauthorized credit lines constituted felony identity fraud. "We will be bringing Brandon in for questioning immediately," the detective said. I left the precinct with an even heavier heart. Not out of fear, but out of absolute betrayal. I thought no matter how terrible Brandon was, he at least had a baseline. But using my personal documents to take out shady loans proved he was fully prepared to throw me in prison. That night, my phone rang. It was Mrs. Reynolds. I hesitated for a moment before answering. Her voice was hoarse as she told me Brandon had been brought in by the police. I told her I knew. She paused, then said my actions were going too far. I let out a cynical laugh and asked if she thought committing identity fraud against me was normal. She argued that Brandon was desperate, which is why he acted recklessly. She pleaded with me, saying if I had any heart at all, I would not send him to jail. I kept my voice completely steady. I told her that if I did not clear this up, those loan sharks would be coming to my door tomorrow. I asked if she wanted to take on that burden. Silence on the other end. I continued, saying I used to call her my future mother-in-law, and I thought I would be a daughter to her family, but she and Brandon treated me like an ATM. Her voice dropped, claiming she just wanted to protect her family's name. I replied that I wanted to protect mine too. The call ended in a heavy silence. 2 days later, Brandon showed up at my house again. This time, he was an absolute mess. No more sharp suits. His shirt was wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot. My dad opened the gate and stood blocking the entrance, demanding to know what he wanted. Brandon's voice was raspy as he asked to see me. I walked out and told him to speak. Brandon looked at me. His gaze was a mix of exhaustion and fury. He demanded I drop the charges, asking if I wanted to see him rot in a cell. I told him I just wanted the truth on paper. Brandon let out a bitter laugh, saying, I won, I got everything, and he lost it all. I looked at him and said he lost everything because he chose to live his life this way. He snapped, yelling that he just wanted a better life. He claimed I was born privileged, with money and property, while he had to fight for everything himself. I stayed quiet for a few seconds. For the first time, he revealed his deepest insecurities. I told him slowly that I never looked down on him, but he looked down on himself the moment he thought he had to use a marriage to get rich. Brandon stared at me, his eyes suddenly softening. He said that if I hadn't blown things up at the engagement party, everything would have been different. I asked him how it would be different. Would I have married him, only to find out years later about his cheating, or that I was legally bound to pay off his massive debts? He went quiet. I reminded him that he called me cruel, but told him the cruelest thing in the world is letting someone trust you, and then exploiting that trust to the core. The evening breeze blew past. The air between us felt as heavy as stone. Brandon looked down and apologized. I looked at him for a long time and said his apology came far too late. I told him he should apologize to his parents and start taking accountability for his actions. My dad spoke up, telling him to go home and never come back here again. Brandon turned around. His footsteps were heavy. I felt zero pity. I only felt that a very old chapter was finally being closed at the appropriate price. A week later, the police concluded there was clear evidence of forgery and unauthorized use of my identity. To avoid immediate felony prosecution, Brandon was forced to sign a legally binding affidavit taking sole responsibility for the debt and agreeing to a strict repayment plan with his lenders. If he defaulted, criminal charges would be reinstated. I received the official notice, and my heart felt a little lighter. Not because he was in trouble, but because I was no longer suspended in uncertainty. That night, my mom sat next to me on the couch. She asked if I was still sad. I thought about it, then shook my head, saying I just regretted wasting 2 years of my life. She stroked my hair and said those 2 years taught me a lesson that was better learned now than suffering for a lifetime. I rested my head on her shoulder. Outside, the city lights were coming on. Apartment 901 had been repaired. The cameras were up. My career was secure. My family was right here. Brandon might have lost a lot, but those were the consequences of his own choices. I looked out into the distance. There was no more fear in my heart, because this time, I didn't just protect my property, I successfully protected my soul. After the police forced Brandon to sign the affidavit, things outside seemed much calmer. There were no more strange SUVs parked outside, no more midnight texts, and no more anonymous letters to my office. But I knew peace on the surface didn't always mean peace of mind. One afternoon while I was working, Danielle called. Her voice was quiet but frantic. She asked if I could get to 901 right away because something happened. I didn't ask questions. I just took the afternoon off. When I arrived, I saw a small crowd in the lobby. They weren't loud, but they were looking toward the elevators with intense curiosity. I got in, my heart pounding. When I reached 901, the door was slightly ajar. Danielle stood in the living room, pale. She pointed outside and said someone threw paint on the door. I turned and saw my dark wooden door violently smashed in with a crowbar, the smart lock completely destroyed. Carved into the drywall next to it were the words, "Pay up, Brandon." A mix of rage and ice ran through my veins. I asked about the cameras. Danielle nodded and handed me her tablet. The footage showed 2 men in baseball caps showing up around midnight. One carried a bucket of paint, the other held a phone flashlight. They did it in minutes and vanished. I asked if we could see their faces. Danielle shook her head, saying it was too blurry. I knew this wasn't random. News of Brandon's debt had spread, and the loan sharks were squeezing him the only way they knew how. My phone rang. Unknown number, I answered. A rough male voice spoke, asking if this was Chloe. He told me to tell Brandon to pay up, or I wouldn't have a moment of peace either. I stated firmly that I had nothing to do with him. The voice mocked me, saying my name was on the paperwork and they didn't care who signed what. If he didn't have the cash, they were coming for the people he promised them. I gripped my phone, stating he had no right to promise anything in my name. The man laughed, told me to figure it out myself, and hung up. Danielle looked at me, terrified. She said this was getting too dangerous. I took a deep breath, told her to call the Chicago PD, and send them all the footage. When I got home that night, my mom had already heard from the neighbors about the vandalism. She waited for me at the door, her voice trembling as she asked if this was because of Brandon. I couldn't lie to her, so I said it probably was. My mom sat on the couch, rubbing her temples, lamenting how peaceful my life used to be. I knelt in front of her. I told her I did nothing wrong and I wasn't going to run, but if I backed down now, they would think I was an easy target. My dad stepped out of the hallway, having listened quietly. He said we needed to rent 901 out immediately, and not leave it empty. I asked if he was worried they would do something worse. He looked at me and said he was worried they would come after me. That broke my heart. I wasn't scared for myself, but I was terrified my parents would get dragged into this mess. 2 days later, the police called me to view a lineup based on the CCTV. They had identified the men as enforcers connected to the illegal lenders Brandon used. They had also interrogated Brandon. The detective told me Brandon confessed he tipped them off to my address because he was desperate. I laughed bitterly. He always had an excuse. The detective assured me they were pressing charges. Walking out of the precinct, I looked at the gray Chicago sky. My anger was fading. All that was left was sheer exhaustion. That afternoon, Mrs. Reynolds came to my house again. She didn't kneel this time, just stood at the gate. She looked incredibly frail. She asked quietly if she could come in. I nodded. She sat in our living room, hands tightly clasped in her lap, unable to meet anyone's eyes. She revealed that Brandon was over $200,000 in debt and she had no idea how to save him. I stayed quiet. She whispered that I once told her a future built on lies wouldn't last, and she finally understood what I meant. My mom poured her a glass of water, telling her gently that what's done is done, and she needed to advise her son to take responsibility. Mrs. Reynolds nodded, tears spilling over. She admitted she had blamed me for ruining the engagement and getting him fired. But she realized now that he had lost his way long before that. The room was silent. It was a late confession, but a confession nonetheless. She clarified she wasn't there to ask for money. She just wanted to say she was too ashamed to ever face me again, but she hoped I wouldn't hold on to the hatred. I sighed. I told her I didn't hate them. I just felt a profound sense of regret. She asked what I regretted. I said I regretted that if she had taught Brandon to live honestly from the start, this story would have ended differently. She looked down, stood up, and walked out of my house without looking back. That night, I stood alone on the balcony. The suburban streets were quiet, entirely ignorant of the chaos I had survived. I thought about Brandon, the 2 years we spent together, and all the plans he had mapped out. All of it was dust now. But I also knew one thing. If I caved now, this vortex would never end. I pulled out my phone and texted Danielle. Find new tenants for 901. Market price. Ironclad lease. Danielle texted back instantly. On it. I put my phone away. My heart was finally returning to its normal rhythm. I didn't want revenge anymore. I just wanted to lock that door forever. But deep down, I had a feeling the business between Brandon and me wasn't entirely finished. After the paint incident, I refused to leave the unit empty. Danielle listed it and screened applicants aggressively. I had the lawyers draft an even stricter lease regarding security and legal liability. 3 days later, a young married couple came to view it. The husband, Adam, was a civil engineer, and his wife, Sarah, was a kindergarten teacher. They wanted a long-term lease because they were expecting their first baby. Standing in the newly repaired kitchen, I watched them whisper excitedly about putting a crib in the corner of the guest room. It was a surreal feeling. This was the exact spot I was supposed to start my own marriage. Now, it was going to be a home for strangers. Adam asked if I had any strict rules. I looked around and smiled, telling them to just treat it like their own home. Sarah beamed and promised they would. We signed the lease that day. Once they moved in, the hallway outside 901 no longer smelled of paint or smoke. The sounds of the young couple laughing made the space feel alive again. I thought maybe this was where it all finally ended. But that night, my phone rang. It was Brandon. I ignored it. He called a second time, then a third. I finally answered, asking what else he could possibly want. His voice sounded depleted, stripped of all its former edge. He told me they were selling their house. I stayed silent. He said his parents' savings couldn't cover his debts, and the bank was going to foreclose. I looked out the balcony. The streetlights reflected off the wet asphalt after a brief rain. I asked him why he was calling me. He said he wanted to see me one last time. I was going to refuse, but I ultimately agreed. Not out of lingering feelings, but because I needed to look the end of this story in the eye. We met at the old coffee shop where we had our first date. Brandon was already there. He was shockingly thin, his shirt hanging off his shoulders, his eyes completely void of their old confidence. He noted quietly that I actually came. I told him I came to hear what he had to say. He looked down and said he was wrong. I didn't interrupt. He confessed he thought he could use our marriage to change his destiny, that marrying me would magically fix everything. He admitted he didn't calculate the consequences. I bluntly told him he didn't calculate the consequences because he didn't see me as a human being. He looked up at me. He asked if I knew he actually did love me at one point. I asked if he really did. He gave a sad smile and said maybe, but he was too greedy. I stared at the man sitting across from me, remembering the guy who proudly stood outside 901 claiming it was our marital home. The gap between those two images was a canyon. I told him he didn't call me here just to reminisce. Brandon took a deep breath. He asked for my help. I smirked and asked what kind of help. He asked me to loan him money. The request didn't shock me, but it turned my blood to ice. I asked him if he heard what he was saying. He pleaded, saying he had no other way, offering to sign any promissory note at any interest rate. I shook my head and told him he still didn't get it. He asked what he didn't get, if I thought his only problem was a lack of cash. I told him his problem wasn't money, his problem was his entire way of living. If I gave him money, he would just find a faster way to ruin himself all over again. He wouldn't change. his eyes filled with pure despair. He asked what I wanted him to do. I told him to take responsibility for his own actions. A long silence fell over the table. The espresso machine hissed in the background. He quietly asked if I had even a shred of feeling left for him. I told him all my feelings evaporated the second he forged my identity for a loan. He clenched his fists and whispered that he didn't know I could be this hardened. I replied that I wasn't hardened, I was just educated. He looked up, saying if I had just kept my mouth shut that day and married him, he would be a different man now. I looked right through him and said if I had kept my mouth shut that day, I would have betrayed myself. That was the final period on the sentence. Brandon sat there a moment longer, then stood up, promising he would never bother me again. I didn't try to stop him. As he walked past my table, I suddenly asked him if he regretted it. He stopped without turning around, said yes, but added it was too late. I watched his back as he walked out of the cafe, his steps slow and heavy. When I got home, my mom was watching TV. She asked if I saw him. I said yes, and told her he asked for money. My mom sighed, and I told her I said no. She nodded, agreeing it was the right call. My dad stepped out of the hallway, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said he was proud of me. I smiled, telling them I wasn't angry anymore, just sad for the girl I used to be. My mom's eyes softened, and she told me I had truly grown up. I slept incredibly well that night. The next morning, Danielle texted me. Adam and Sarah were inviting me over to 901 for a housewarming dinner. Reading that text, my heart felt warm. Apartment 901 was no longer a monument to betrayal. It was the starting line for a brand new family. I replied that I would be there. Maybe the real ending isn't when someone leaves, but when their memory no longer has any power over you. But deep down, I still wondered if Brandon would truly vanish from my life like he promised. That evening, I arrived at Unit 901 for Adam and Sarah's dinner. The moment the door opened, the rich aroma of roast chicken and garlic mashed potatoes welcomed me. Sarah gave me a bright smile, inviting me in and apologizing for the boxes they were still unpacking. I stepped inside, looking around the familiar space. My cream sofa was still there, but now there was a small vase of flowers on the coffee table and a beautiful wooden crib by the window. The cold, alien feeling I once felt here was entirely replaced by warmth. Adam poured me a glass of wine, thanking me profusely for renting to them, noting how hard it was to find a good place in Chicago. I smiled and said as long as they took good care of it, I was happy. Dinner was simple but filled with laughter. Sarah talked about her kindergarten students, and Adam discussed his engineering projects. They had no idea about the dark history of the condo, and I had no desire to bring it up. Before leaving, I stood on the balcony for a moment, looking at the city traffic below. I realized how far I had come from a girl shocked to find her own property being used as a fake wedding gift, to a woman who faced down fraud, debt collectors, and threats. I truly thought this was where the story closed. But the next morning at the office, my mother called. Her voice wasn't shaking, but it was incredibly heavy. She told me to come home immediately. I asked what was wrong. She said Mrs. Reynolds had just called her. I froze. I asked what she said. My mom paused for a few seconds before telling me Brandon was in the hospital. I sat frozen at my desk and asked why. My mom said she didn't have all the details, just that Mrs. Reynolds was sobbing. I took the rest of the day off. On the drive back, my mind was a mess. Not out of lingering love, but because Brandon's name was still tethered to a significant chunk of my life history. When I got home, my mom was waiting. She said she wouldn't force me to go, but she felt I had the right to know. I sat down and asked what happened. She said she heard he got into a fight with the debt collectors because he missed a payment, and he had sustained head injuries. I closed my eyes. The memories of the loan sharks, the red paint, and the threatening calls came rushing back. I wasn't surprised. I just felt a vague sense of sorrow. Late that afternoon, Mrs. Reynolds came to our house. There were no tears this time, just a hollow, exhausted face. I opened the door for her. She told me in a raspy voice that Brandon was beaten up for falling behind on his payments. I stayed quiet. She quickly added that she wasn't there to beg for money. She just didn't want me to think he was rotten to the core. He made mistakes, she said. But he didn't deserve to be beaten like a dog. I looked at her and asked what she expected me to do. She shook her head, saying she didn't know. She was just drowning in guilt. My mother gently asked what the loan sharks were demanding now. Mrs. Reynolds said they gave them 1 more month. If they didn't pay, they were taking the house. I sighed and asked what Brandon had to say. She shook her head, stating he specifically told her not to come see me. That stunned me. I asked if he really said that. She nodded, saying he admitted everything was his own fault and that I had nothing to do with it anymore. I was quiet for a very long time. Out of all the terrible choices Brandon had made, this might have been the first time he actively chose not to drag me down with him. Mrs. Reynolds stood up, saying she was going home and wouldn't bother me again. I walked her to the door with a heavy heart. That night, I sat alone in my room. I remembered our last meeting at the cafe when he asked if I still had feelings for him, and I coldly shut him down. Now, with him lying in a hospital bed, I questioned myself. I didn't love him anymore, but I didn't want to see someone I once trusted hit rock bottom either. I called Victoria. I asked if she knew which hospital he was in. She paused and asked why I wanted to know. I said I just did. She sighed and gave me the name of the county hospital, but warned me not to let myself get used again. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. That evening, I stood outside the hospital entrance for a long time. The harsh, white fluorescent lights from the patient windows made the night feel freezing. I didn't go in. I turned around and drove home. It wasn't because I didn't care, but because I knew that if I crossed those hospital doors, the boundaries I fought so hard to build would blur again. I had chosen to step out of his hurricane, and I had to stand by that choice. The next morning, I received a text from Brandon's number. It was just one word. Sorry. I read it over and over, then put my phone down. It was an apology meant not to repair, but to sever the tie completely. I didn't text back. Later that week, I dropped by 901. Sarah was hanging up new curtains, and Adam smiled when he saw me, waving me in. I walked into the bright, sunlit apartment. The laughter of this young couple echoed in the rooms that had witnessed so much betrayal. I suddenly understood that life always moves forward. One door slams shut so another can swing open. And this time I was walking through it without carrying Brandon's ghost, though I knew my own journey was just beginning. After that final apology text, Brandon never contacted me again. I didn't reply either. That one word sat in my inbox like an unfinished sentence, but I had no desire to write the ending. A few days later, Mrs. Reynolds called my mother again. This time, she wasn't crying. She just sounded drained. She said Brandon was discharged from the hospital but still needed outpatient care. My mother, sitting next to me, put the phone on speaker. She asked how he was doing. Mrs. Reynolds said his injuries weren't critical, just some stitches, and the loan shark seemed to be backing off legally for the moment. I sat quietly, listening. Mrs. Reynolds then asked softly if Chloe was there. I spoke up and said I was. She paused, then relayed a message. Brandon wanted me to know he was handling his debts himself, and he would never cross my path again. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or hollow. I just said, "That's good." The call ended. My mom looked at me for a long time and asked if I wanted to visit him. I shook my head, telling her I had already stood outside the hospital doors, and that was enough. She nodded, agreeing it was for the best. The following days passed with a new sense of peace. My schedule at the design firm was packed with new projects. I poured all my energy into blueprints and budgets. Whenever I had a quiet moment, the memories would drift back, but they lacked the sharp sting they used to have. One afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. A middle-aged man's voice asked if this was Chloe. I said yes and asked who was calling. He introduced himself as Brandon's uncle. I froze and asked what he needed. He quickly clarified he wasn't calling to place blame and asked if we could meet briefly, sounding afraid I would hang up. I hesitated, but agreed. Not because I had unfinished business, but because I wanted to hear the story from a different angle. We met at a small tea shop. He was in his 50s, thin, with gentle but tired eyes. He thanked me for coming. I told him to go ahead. He sighed and said he wasn't there to defend Brandon or apologize for him. Brandon was a grown man who ruined his own life. But I wanted to give you some closure, he explained. He revealed that their family was not nearly as wealthy as Brandon made them out to be. The house Brandon used to brag about was actually heavily mortgaged. I stayed quiet. The uncle explained that Brandon had a severe inferiority complex since childhood. Watching his peers succeed made him obsessed with status. When he met me, he viewed it as his golden ticket to escape feeling inadequate. I stared at the steaming cup of tea in front of me, the vapor slightly blurring my vision. I noted that the method he chose was deeply flawed. The uncle nodded, saying Brandon was paying the price for it now. A brief silence followed. I am not asking you to forgive him, the uncle said. I just wanted you to know the truth so you can move on without wondering why it happened. I looked up at him and said I didn't hate him, I just couldn't ever go back. He nodded, looking slightly relieved. He told me I was a very strong woman, and that was probably why Brandon both loved and feared me. That sentence echoed in my mind for a long time after he left. That night, I sat with my parents in the living room. My dad was reading the paper, and my mom was knitting. My dad asked what the uncle wanted. I told them everything. My dad folded his newspaper, stating that an inferiority complex is no excuse for doing evil, but not everyone has the strength to overcome their own insecurities. My mom agreed. I looked at the two of them, suddenly realizing how incredibly lucky I was to have a family that taught me to face my problems head-on instead of running from them. A few weeks later, Danielle casually mentioned she heard Brandon was selling the last car he owned. I just replied with a flat, "Oh." Then, one evening as I was leaving my office building, Brandon was standing in the lobby. This time, he didn't try to approach me or act defensive. He just said he wanted to tell me one thing. I listened. He told me he sold his car, was looking for a new job, and was probably moving out of state. I nodded. He added that he didn't expect my forgiveness. He just wanted me to know he wouldn't bother me ever again. I looked at him, searching for any lingering resentment in his eyes, but all I saw was total exhaustion. I told him to live a good life. He said he was trying. We stood there for a few seconds. No more rage, no more false hopes. Just two people who once walked the same path, now turning in opposite directions. He said goodbye. I said goodbye back. He turned around, and this time I didn't watch him walk away. That evening, I stopped by Unit 901. Sarah was folding baby clothes, and Adam had just finished installing a new bookshelf. Sarah asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. I smiled and said I was just dropping by. Sitting in the middle of that room, I finally realized what I had learned from this entire nightmare. Marriage is not a lottery ticket to change your social class. Money is not the foundation of peace and love. Without mutual respect, it just becomes a weapon. I left 901 after dark. Standing in the lobby, I looked up at the familiar balcony. A warm yellow light spilled from the 9th floor windows. There are places that no longer belong to us, but leave us with invaluable lessons. I had finally stepped out of the shadow of a massive mistake. After that final encounter in the office lobby, I never saw Brandon again. No calls, no texts, no unexpected run-ins. Everything truly receded into the past like a movie that had finished rolling. But real life isn't a movie. It doesn't end on a dramatic freeze frame. It continues with very ordinary days. One morning, my mom called me down for breakfast early. On the table was a bowl of oatmeal and a small piece of paper. She told me to read it. It was a wedding invitation for the daughter of an old family friend. In the corner, my mom had written, "Come with us, so you don't get bored at home." I looked at her and asked if she was worried I was traumatized by weddings. She smiled and said she was just worried that tripping once would make me lock my doors forever. I let out a soft sigh and told her I wasn't locking my doors. I was just going to open them much slower from now on. My dad walked out of his room, adjusting his glasses, and said, "Slower is good. Slower means you're sure." That phrase stuck with me all day. At work, I was promoted to lead a massive new project. My boss called me in and told me the project was critical, and he needed someone fully focused who wouldn't let personal drama affect the bottom line. I nodded and assured him I understood. Walking out of his office, I felt a distinct shift. I no longer had this fiery, desperate need to prove myself, nor did I feel like a victim. I just wanted to excel at my craft. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I'm Brandon's debt collector. You don't need to worry anymore." He started making installment payments. I stared at the text for a long time. Not out of fear, but sheer surprise. I didn't reply. 2 days later, Mrs. Reynolds called. She said she just wanted to give me an update. Brandon was moving to a construction project out in Texas. I told her I knew. She added that he asked her to pass on a message. He wanted to thank me for not pushing him over the absolute edge when I had the chance. I stayed quiet, then said I only did what I had to do to protect myself. She whispered that she understood, and said that if she ever had a daughter, she would want her to be exactly like me. I paused, then told her not to say that, because everyone has their own destiny. The call ended. I stood by the window, looking at the dark Chicago skyline. People come into our lives to teach us something. Brandon was one of them. A weekend later, I went with my parents to that wedding. Watching the bride in her white dress, her face glowing with joy, I didn't feel the bitter envy I thought I would. My mom whispered, asking how I felt. I told her I felt fine, and that true happiness is real. My mom smiled. On the drive back, my dad asked if I met someone new one day, would I still be highly suspicious? I thought about it and said I wouldn't be suspicious, but I wouldn't rush into anything either. My dad nodded, saying that was enough. A few weeks later, Danielle called with great news. Sarah had her baby. She sent her thanks, claiming my condo brought them incredible luck. I laughed and told her it wasn't the condo that brought the luck. It was the people living in it. That night, I stopped by 901 with a fruit basket. Sarah opened the door, looking exhausted but radiant. She welcomed me in. I looked around. Wedding photos now hung on the walls, and a healthy potted plant sat in the corner. Adam smiled and said the condo was a perfect match for them. I smiled back, suggesting it was because they actually respected it. Sitting there, I remembered the afternoon Mrs. Reynolds paraded me through this exact space, claiming it as my bridal gift. I remembered the shock, the fury, and the absolute resolve. If I hadn't kept my cool that day and dug for the truth, I would have walked straight into a fraudulent marriage. Driving home, I asked myself if I had any regrets. No. I only regretted trusting someone so blindly. But trusting someone isn't a crime. The crime belongs to the person who exploits it. One evening while I was working late, Brandon unexpectedly texted me. I'm at the airport. My flight leaves tomorrow morning. I read the message, put the phone down, and eventually typed back, have a safe flight, delivered. No reply, and I didn't expect one. I slept incredibly well that night. The next morning, I woke up early, brewed a cup of coffee, and stood on the balcony watching the sunrise. My life was still here. My parents were still here. My career was waiting for me. Brandon had left, taking his lies and his own brutal lessons with him. As for me, I was no longer the naive girl standing in front of a fake marital home. I was a woman who knew her absolute worth. I knew there was a lot left to come, and I was ready for it. After wishing him a safe flight, Brandon never replied. There are some goodbyes meant not to reconnect, but to silently release someone from your life. My days grew busier than ever. The new project hit a critical phase, and I was coming home late almost every night. But every time I walked through the door and saw my mom keeping a bowl of soup warm for me, or my dad reading the paper waiting up, I felt a profound sense of peace. One night, as I walked in, my mom called me over. On the table was a plain white envelope with no return address. She said a courier dropped it off that afternoon. I opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. Chloe, I've left the city. This project will keep me away for years. I don't dare ask for your forgiveness. I just want to say I finally understand why you did what you did. If I had known what enough felt like back then, maybe our story would be different. Thank you for once believing in me, Brandon. I read the letter, folded it back up, and slipped it into the envelope. My mom looked at me, searching my face, and asked how I felt. I took a soft breath and said, I feel nothing at all, Mom. My dad stepped out of the hallway, having caught the end of the conversation. He noted that it was good he was gone, and that everyone has their own path. I nodded. That night, sitting in my room, I thought about everything that had happened since the day Mrs. Reynolds took me to 901. Every detail was crystal clear. Brandon's arrogant smirk talking about our future home, the speakerphone demanding rent, the photos at the engagement party, the smell of gas, the red paint. It felt like a chaotic drama, but to me, it was a masterclass in boundaries and self-worth. The next morning, I did something I had never considered before. I went to a real estate attorney and transferred the deed of apartment 901 into a joint trust between myself and my parents. When I got home, I handed them the paperwork. I told them that from now on, 901 belonged to all of us. My mom was shocked and asked why I did that. I told her assets are never more important than family, and I didn't want to hold everything by myself anymore. My dad stared at me for a long time before saying I had truly matured. I smiled, admitting that without them, I wouldn't have had the sanity to pull the plug when I did. My mom squeezed my hand, saying family is meant to be a safety net, not a place to fight alone. That evening, I stopped by 901. Sarah was sewing baby clothes, and Adam had just gotten off work, holding a tube of blueprints. Sarah asked if I had good news. I smiled and told them I just put the condo into a family trust with my parents. Sarah beamed and said that meant it was even more stable now. I looked around the room. The warm yellow lights, the hum of a fan, the smell of fresh dinner. There were no traces left of the turbulent days. On the drive home, I thought about Brandon. Maybe on a dusty construction site in Texas, he was starting over. Maybe he would stumble a few more times. Maybe he would actually learn. I no longer blamed him. nor did I care what he did. A week later, my project was officially greenlit. My boss shook my hand in front of the whole firm, praising my work. I stood there, listening to the applause, feeling a deep, unshakable calm. That night at family dinner, my dad poured the drinks while my mom served my plate. My dad asked if I had thought about taking my career even further, perhaps going to grad school or starting my own firm. I realized that I used to think marriage was the only logical next step in life. Now, I knew the next step could be literally anything I chose. I smiled and said I would think about it. Standing on the balcony that night, looking at the starless Chicago sky, the city was bright and loud, but my heart was completely quiet. I remembered the question I asked Mrs. Reynolds on day one. Is this really the condo you prepared for us? That question once paralyzed me. Now, I could smile at the girl I used to be, because without that moment, I would never have learned how to fiercely guard my own value. And I knew there was only one thing left to truly close this chapter. Some stories don't end with a slamming door. They end on a perfectly normal morning. I woke up early. The sun sliced through the blinds, casting long shadows on the hardwood floor. My mom was already up, the sound of bacon sizzling in the kitchen. My dad was at the table reading the paper. My mom called out, asking if I was awake. I sat down, holding the warm mug of coffee she handed me, and looked at my parents. My heart felt full in the simplest way possible. No midnight threats, no loan sharks, no Brandon taking up space in my brain. My dad folded his paper and asked what I wanted to do this weekend. I thought about it and said I wanted to drive out to the country to visit Grandma. My mom looked up, noting I hadn't been there in a long time. I nodded. I felt like, after everything, I needed one quiet trip to officially close the book. That weekend, we drove to upstate New York. The rural roads were narrow, lined with golden fields. The wind carried the familiar scent of earth and pine. Grandma looked at me and smiled, saying she heard her granddaughter was incredibly busy. I smiled back and said not anymore. That afternoon, I sat in her backyard under a massive old oak tree, listening to the birds. I reflected on every phase I had survived. Falling in love, trusting, suspecting, discovering, exposing, fighting, and finally, letting go. If you asked me if it hurt, I would say yes. But the pain didn't break me. It woke me up. That night over tea, Grandma asked if I was terrified of marriage now. I laughed and told her I wasn't scared of marriage. I was just scared of choosing the wrong person. Grandma nodded wisely, saying a wrong choice can be fixed, as long as you don't let one mistake make you lose faith in yourself. That simple truth stayed with me. Back in the city, I received a text from an unknown number. A guy claiming to be Brandon's former coworker said Brandon left something for me. I met him in the lobby of my building. The guy handed me a small velvet box, saying Brandon felt it wasn't right to contact me directly. I opened it. Inside was the diamond engagement ring from that fateful day. I stared at it. My heart didn't even skip a beat. It was just an object. I texted Brandon's old number. I got it. He replied instantly. Keep it, sell it, throw it away. I have no right to it. I stared at the screen, then put my phone away. That night, I placed the ring in a safety deposit box. Not as a romantic keepsake, but as a hard-earned trophy, a reminder that I survived a terrible choice and had the absolute courage to walk away. A few months later, I got an email offering me a prestigious 6-month architectural fellowship in Europe. I read it over and over, my heart racing with pure excitement. I told my parents that night. My mom looked a bit worried, noting how far away it was. I told her it was only 6 months. My dad smiled and told me to go, to expand my horizons while I was still young. I looked at them, overwhelmed with gratitude for their endless support. Before my flight, I made one last stop at 901. I stood on the balcony, remembering the day I first walked in as a supposed bride-to-be. If I hadn't been vigilant that day, I would currently be a woman trapped in a marriage of suspicion, debt, and exhaustion. I touched the balcony railing and whispered to myself, "Thank you for not staying quiet." My phone buzzed. A text from Brandon. "Heard you're heading to Europe. Best of luck." I looked at the screen and replied, "Thank you, nothing more." No resentment, no longing. Just two people who once knew each other, now wishing each other well from a distance. At the airport departure gate, my mom hugged me tight, telling me to take care of myself. My dad patted my shoulder, reminding me how strong I was. I walked through the TSA checkpoint and looked back at them. In that exact moment, I realized the greatest asset I had protected through all of this wasn't apartment 901, my career, or my pride. It was myself. I once asked my future mother-in-law if she had truly prepared a home for us. Today, I didn't need anyone to prepare a home for me. I was building my own life. And if I ever do get married, it will be because I choose to, not because a man promised me an illusion. The plane took off, and the Chicago skyline shrank beneath the clouds. I closed my eyes and smiled. A chapter was permanently closed, and I was flying into the next one without carrying a single shadow of a lie. I was left with the profound peace of a woman who fully understands her own worth. Final reflection. Dear readers, there are stories that leave us not just with the tragedy of a failed romance, but with a blueprint for survival. Chloe's story is not about a woman who was betrayed. It is about a woman who knew exactly when to pull the plug. The most valuable takeaway is not how Brandon scammed her, fell into debt, or faced his karma. The most valuable lesson is that Chloe refused to play the victim in silence. In life, when faced with a bitter truth, many women are given two choices: close their eyes to protect their public image, or face it head-on to protect themselves. Not everyone has the sanity to choose the latter, because the truth is always expensive. Chloe chose the truth. She didn't rush to scream and shout, she didn't play the blame game, and she didn't curse her fate. She investigated, she observed, and she stayed terrifyingly calm. She let the truth expose itself under the brightest spotlight. That is what true resilience looks like. Resilience isn't screaming so people fear you. It's maintaining your absolute composure while your heart is breaking. What is the ultimate lesson here? Never trade your dignity for a wedding reception. Marriage is not a life raft for someone drowning in their own insecurities or financial ambitions. It is a partnership between two fully formed adults. If one person views it as a shortcut to wealth while the other views it as a sanctuary, the foundation is doomed from the start. I want to tell anyone reading this: never be afraid to lose someone who does not respect you. Losing them is not a tragedy. It is a rescue mission. As for Brandon, we shouldn't just condemn him. Brandon was wrong. He was wrong for being greedy, wrong for his crippling insecurity, and wrong for looking for a shortcut. But his story is a glaring warning to many men. If you cannot stand on your own 2 feet, you will live your entire life in fear of being abandoned. A real man does not look for a wife to save him from his own failures. He saves himself before he even thinks about leading a family. For parents, this story is a crucial reminder. Do not pressure your children to rush down the aisle just because you want to see them settled. Happiness does not come from a timeline, it comes from true compatibility. Forcing someone into a marriage when trust is not fully established is like pushing them into a casino. Chloe was incredibly lucky to have parents who knew when to step up, and family is a safety net, not a pressure cooker. And there is something even deeper than all of this. Chloe didn't just win against Brandon, she won against herself. She beat the fear of being labeled a spinster. She beat the societal pressure to just get married. She beat the temptation to just stay quiet for the sake of keeping the peace. Some might ask, after all of this, does Chloe still believe in love? I am certain she does, but it is a different kind of love. It is the love of a woman who knows her value does not depend on who chooses her, but rather on who she decides to choose. Every woman might need her own apartment 901 inches life, a moment of brutal clarity. A moment where we realize that if we do not stand up for ourselves today, we will live in regret tomorrow. Dear readers, if you are in a relationship that constantly makes you doubt your own reality, hit the brakes. Real love will never make you feel small. Real love will not force you to hide, over-explain, or sacrifice your self-respect. Real love brings peace. And if you are a man wrestling with ambition, remember this: a career can be built with sweat, but a family can only be built with absolute honesty. Never use a marriage as a ladder to climb out of your own insecurities.